Light Deep. Hello everyone, wishing you all good health and peace in life. One midnight, CEO James's sudden call left Deep restless with worry. What would become of her if James was no longer by her side? In the silence of her fears, Deep made a brave choice. She opened her heart and adopted the little girl, even without James around. Love gave her courage, and hope lit the path she chose to walk alone. The night felt heavier than usual. Deep sat alone in her quiet farmhouse, the silence broken only by the faint chirping of crickets outside. She had just returned from a long day at the market, selling pineapples and melons she had harvested with her own hands. Her body was tired, but her heart was restless. James had flown away at dawn for an urgent business trip, leaving behind only a short letter telling her not to worry. But when the phone rang near midnight, her heart leapt with both joy and fear. It was James. His voice carried fatigue across the ocean, yet also a warmth that wrapped around her like a blanket. He had gone straight into a meeting as soon as he landed. "Don't worry about me," he said softly. "Everything is under control. Take care of yourself. Wait for me." Deep smiled through the tremble in her voice, but when the call ended, the loneliness returned sharper than before. What would happen to her, she wondered, if James wasn't there anymore? Earlier that day, fate had led her to a strange encounter. On the side of a dusty road, she had found a little girl no older than 4 sitting alone, crying with red, swollen eyes. Deep knelt down, asked her name, but the child only whispered, "I am waiting for my mother." Hours had passed, yet no one came. After reporting to the local officers, Deep was asked to bring the girl home for a few days until her family could be found. The child's name was Nee, and from the moment she held Deep's hand, she refused to let go. That evening, they cooked together. Nee's tiny fingers tried to pick vegetables, her laughter filling the kitchen with a light Deep hadn't felt in weeks. At the table, the little girl pressed her palms together and whispered a prayer before eating, reminding Deep of innocence she thought the world had forgotten. But later, when the house grew quiet, Nee asked in her small, fragile voice, "Where's my mother?" And then, "Why are you alone, too?" The question pierced Deep's chest. She could only stroke the child's hair and whisper, "Because sometimes the people we love have to go far away, but it doesn't mean they don't love us." Deep realized in that moment that her life had changed. James was far away, fighting battles in the corporate world, and she could no longer depend on him to fill every void. Here in her arms was another fragile life, looking up at her with hope. The fear of being left behind turned into courage. Even if James wasn't here, even if the nights grew colder, she would not let loneliness defeat her. She would protect this little girl, nurture her, and give her a home. That night, when the moonlight fell across the quiet yard, Deep sat by Nee's bedside, listening to her soft breathing as she slept. Her heart was still heavy with longing for James, yet stronger than before. For the first time, she understood. Love was not only about waiting for someone to return, it was also about giving, without fear. And in that small farmhouse, surrounded by shadows and silence, Deep chose to open her heart. Even without James, she would not be alone. The following morning, the rooster crowed before dawn. Deep woke to the sound of little footsteps pattering across the wooden floor. Nee was already up, sitting by the window, staring outside as if she was still waiting for her mother to return. Deep's heart ached at the sight, but she forced a gentle smile. "Come," she whispered, taking the child's hand, "let's go to the fields." Together, they walked through rows of green crops glistening with morning dew. Deep showed Nee how to pick vegetables, how to tell which melons were ripe, and how to carry them carefully in a basket. The little girl's laughter rang out like silver bells, chasing away the shadows of the night before. Yet deep inside, Diep could not ignore the hollow silence every time she thought of James. His voice had reached her across the distance, but his absence lingered like an empty chair at the table. At the market, Diep balanced her baskets while Nee stood beside her, shy but curious, watching people come and go. Some customers smiled and asked about the little girl, and Diep simply answered, "She is with me for now." Strangely, saying those words made her feel a warmth she couldn't explain, as if she had already become the child's mother. That evening, James called again. His tone was calm, but she could sense the storm behind his words. Something was wrong with his company. Funds were being withdrawn, and powerful rivals were moving against him. He tried to reassure her, but Diep knew the fight ahead would be brutal. "Diep," James said quietly, "I don't know when I can come back. It may take longer than we thought. Promise me you'll stay strong." Diep hesitated, glancing at Nee, who was playing with a small wooden toy in the corner. For a moment, fear gripped her. What if James never returned? What if she was left to face everything alone? But then she looked at the little girl's bright eyes and felt courage rise within her. "I will wait for you," she answered, steady and clear. "But even if you are far away, I will not stop living. There is someone here who needs me now. You must fight your battle, and I will fight mine." For a moment, silence filled the line. Then James whispered, "That's why I love you." When the call ended, Diep closed her eyes and let the tears fall, but they were no longer tears of fear. They were tears of strength. She tucked Nee into bed that night, humming softly, and realized that life had given her a new purpose. She was no longer just waiting for James. She was building something of her own, creating a home, protecting a fragile soul who needed her. And perhaps when James returned, he would not only find the woman he loved waiting for him, he would find a family. Days turned into weeks. Diep's life had quietly shifted. Each morning she rose with the sun, guiding little Nee through the routines of the farm. Together they watered the vegetables, gathered eggs, and carried produce to the market. Villagers began to notice the bond between them, whispering with fondness that Diep looked like a young mother raising her daughter. But when night fell and the house grew still, Diep's thoughts returned to James. His calls became shorter, his voice more weary each time. He never admitted it openly, but she could hear the weight pressing down on him. Something dark was happening in his world of contracts, investments, and silent enemies. One evening, as Diep was preparing dinner, the phone rang again. James's voice was tight, almost broken. "Diep," he said, "there's someone behind all of this. A man I trusted withdrew his support, and now others are following. The company could collapse. If I fail, I might not be able to return for a very long time." Diep froze, knife in her hand, her heart racing. She wanted to tell him she was scared, that the thought of losing him was unbearable, but then she felt a small tug at her dress. Nee, standing there, with wide, innocent eyes. In that moment, Diep understood that fear would not protect anyone. She had to be strong for both of them. "You will not fail," she told James firmly, her voice steadier than she expected. "And even if everything is taken from us, I will still be here. I am not waiting helplessly. I am building something with my own hands. You are not alone." Silence lingered on the line before James whispered, "You don't know how much strength you give me." That night, after the call, Diep sat by Nee's bed and brushed the little girl's hair as she drifted to sleep. She realized that love was not only about romance or longing, it was about courage. In the face of uncertainty, she had opened her heart to James, and now she had opened her heart to a child who needed her. Both bonds were fragile, yet both gave her purpose, but fate had more to reveal. One afternoon, while selling melons at the crowded market, Diep noticed a stranger watching her. He was sharply dressed, with eyes that lingered not only on the fruit, but on her and the child at her side. He bought nothing, said nothing, but the way he observed them sent a shiver through her. That night, she couldn't forget his face. What she did not know was that the stranger was connected to James's rival, the very man tearing down his company, and through the little girl knee. An unexpected truth was about to surface, one that could bind Diep even deeper into James's dangerous world. Life often places us in situations we do not expect. To Diep never imagined she would one day care for a little girl abandoned by fate, nor that she would stand alone while the man she loved, CEO James, fought battles in a distant city. Yet in those quiet moments of fear and responsibility, she discovered a truth that many of us forget. Real strength does not come from wealth, power, or promises. It comes from the heart that chooses to love despite uncertainty. Diep's story teaches us that love is not only about waiting for someone or depending on them. It is about standing tall when everything feels unstable. By opening her heart to the orphaned child, she showed that compassion can create a family even when blood does not. By encouraging James, she reminded us that words spoken with faith can become the anchor someone else needs to keep fighting. The greatest lesson is that even in the absence of those we depend on, we are never powerless. Life asks us to endure, to nurture, and to give meaning to the days we live. Diep found courage not by clinging to James's return, but by building a life worth sharing when he came back. She turned fear into action, loneliness into love, and despair into hope. From her journey, we learn that every trial we face carries a hidden choice: to fall into despair or to rise with strength. Diep chose the latter, and through her, we see that love is not just a feeling, it is an act of courage. The days grew heavier with silence from James. His calls became rare, his words wrapped in exhaustion, and sometimes the phone rang only once before cutting off. Diep tried not to let her worry show, but every night when she lay beside little Nee, her heart pounded with questions she could not answer. What if James never returned? What if the battles he was fighting swallowed him whole? Meanwhile, the stranger from the market began to appear more often. At first he lingered in the distance, blending with the crowd, but soon his presence was unmistakable. His sharp suit and cold eyes did not belong to the village. Diep pretended not to notice, though every instinct told her danger was approaching. One evening, after selling the last of her pineapples, she gathered Nee in her arms and hurried home. But the stranger followed. His voice finally broke the silence. "You care for that child as if she were your own," he said smoothly, blocking her path. "Do you even know who she really is?" Diep tightened her hold on Nee, shielding her small frame. "She's just a lost child. That's all that matters." The man's lips curled into a half-smile. "Lost, yes, but not forgotten. She belongs to someone who has been watching you very closely." His eyes narrowed. James would be very interested to know. Fear burned in Diep's chest, but she refused to let it show. She walked past him without a word, holding Nee tighter, praying he would not follow. That night she barred the doors and windows, her mind racing. Later, the phone rang again. It was James. His voice was weaker than before. "Diep, there are enemies moving closer. They know about you. They might try to use you to hurt me." Diep's breath caught. She looked at me sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm outside. "Then listen to me," she said firmly. "Whatever happens, don't let fear break you. I will protect her, and I will protect myself. But you must survive, James. Come back to us." For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the sound of distant static filled the line. Finally, James whispered, "You are braver than I ever imagined. Promise me you'll hold on." Diep closed her eyes, her tears hidden in the dark. "I promise." Outside, the night stretched endlessly, but in her heart, a fire had been lit. She was no longer just a girl waiting for love. She was a guardian, a mother, and the anchor James needed in the storm. What she did not yet know was that the little girl sleeping in her arms held the key to secrets that could either save James or destroy them both.